then my living shall not be in vain. No, my living shall not be in vain. If I can help somebody as I pass along, then my living shall not be in vain. Good morning. I stand here today to let you know I am not Michael Sams. I don't know how many of you got the email or got to read the email that in this process of finalizing our closing experience to send our colleagues and families home, that yet another thing occurred. And that was that Michael injured himself and is not able to be with us today. And so, why was Stephen here? Why is Jamie here at this time of closing the convention? And so we were both invited to help us realize and to live out our conference theme. We have been invited during this conference to do 4 things, and that is to consider, to collaborate, to create, and to commit. We had wonderful experiences from the beginning of this week from our opening speakers who have been inviting us to consider all week long who we are, particularly in our places of privilege and our identities as cisgender folks, as people living currently able, as people who might be born in the U.S., and as understanding what it means to be fully who you are. Understanding disabilities, understanding cisgender identity, understanding immigration status. These are the things that have been put before us. And so similarly to Stephen and understanding our faith traditions. Now, one of the things that I was noticing even in the moment is that as I stand here, each of those identities I stand in privilege. I stand in Christian privilege. I stand in able-bodied privilege. I stand in cisgender privilege. I stand in U.S. privilege. And in that space, I'm always wondering, will I get it right? Will I mess up? And so as we invite you to go back, we've had a wonderful opportunity to be challenged, to be invited to consider things. This, what I would leave you with, is that each of those moments were particularly important because they invited us to slow down for a minute. When Ibu was on the stage, he invited us to slow down for a minute and consider religion, faith, spirituality, belief systems, ways of knowing. When Steph was here, we were invited to consider what it means to experience the world in ways that the world may not have been set up in accessible ways for us. As Jose came to the stage, invited us to consider the question of who is a citizen. And as Laverne shared with us, to consider what does this gender binary that we live in, this construction of gender, do to all of our humanity. We've been invited to consider these things. As I stand on this stage, I don't have to consider those things. I live in a way where I can get by without paying attention, and often do get by without paying attention. But as my brother, Dr. Quay, invited us to do, is that we must do better. I work in the world every day, and many of you know that, as a social justice change agent. And while I do that every day, I still must commit to doing better. I remember, as my brother, as I honor the people in the T-Circle who said some things about how the leadership was doing around this association, or how we were doing around inclusion of trans and gender nonconforming. I had in my head, but they don't know how hard we've been working. I had in my head, well, they don't know how far we've come. Because I was a part of the beginning of the struggle during my time, since I am so aware, as we stand here on the 50th anniversary of Selma, that it did not start with me. And it will not end with me. So I'm really clear that I was a part of the beginning of the struggle during my time, when we could have a standing committee, the 30th anniversary of the standing committee. I'm aware that we didn't start with the T, and so we get the T and it's not done. There's more work to be done, but I'm aware that I could get lulled into this false sense of security, that we are done, that we've done so much work because we can have a cabaret that the leadership will show up at that makes us finished. We are not finished. We must do better. We simply will not allow having trans and gender nonconforming folks as entertainment be enough. That is not the space we want to be in. And while that may not ever have been our intentions, that is the felt impact. So this is a particular moment, a contextual moment, where we are looking at and being reminded to pay attention around gender identity, around gender expression, and how, in fact, those of us who walk in privilege in that context must do better and create spaces where all of our communities can feel valued, welcomed, and included. The next part, though, of our commitment and our theme is to collaborate. And so how do we do better? We want to collaborate with the T-Circle. Important. And we can't just collaborate in the moments when we need them. We know better than that, right? We can't just collaborate with any minoritized communities, our undocumented folks, our people living with disabilities or with different abilities. We can't just collaborate with minoritized religious communities when it's convenient for us and we need them. We must be in collaboration around all of our issues, and particularly when they're in need of us to show up as allies. Collaboration requires that we're paying attention to the context in which we are asking. So ask, collaborate, partner in the moments when we can be most helpful and not most needy. If we do that, we can then create spaces that feel like we're in it. One of my key foundations is that communities are built through creating relationships of commitment and trust. I'm standing here today, and as I spent time with my colleagues, and again, so I want you to pay attention to every time I try to catch myself in the gender binary. I keep getting ready to say brothers and sisters. That's all my religious stuff. It's all intersecting, and that my religious stuff is where some of the gender stuff began. So I have to be willing to deconstruct that if I'm going to be willing to show up fully engaging in creating an open and welcoming community across gender. And so as I sat with my community, I'm reminded of how important it is to to pay attention to what we get to create together. And it is about building relationships of commitment and trust. My hope as I stand here as a cisgender man with all this privilege in this context is that I'm not doing harm. I'm not at all convinced that I stand here representing the voices. I trust as you all listen to Laverne, that you heard a message that you feel like you can live and leave here with understanding that we must do better. We will create together the campuses and the communities that we want if, in fact, we make a commitment to doing better. And so as I take my seat, I want to ask you, what are you committing to do? It is important that that commitment might look like spending the time to do the self-work so that you can deconstruct what you show up in around gender identity. How do you show up as the police in this conversation? It might be about what are the relationships that you're in. I'm reminded of myself as a person who, as an African American, going to lots of my RA's weddings, and I had worked at predominantly white institutions, and I would walk into those weddings and folks would say, "Oh, you must be Jamie." And I would say, "And how might you know that?" And I realized that as I saw the pictures after the wedding, there was a unique difference about me as I stood amongst the families and the friends. And so I started telling my white friends, I go to no more weddings until you get some other people of color friends. But as I was doing my wonderful academic, brilliant stuff around trans and gender identity and talking about the conflation of sex orientation and gender identity, I have this scholarly knowledge around that. I was reminded as I was speaking it at the moment that I had no trans friends, that I had no gender nonconforming friends that I knew of, that I was aware of, that I was engaged with. So I got in the moment of calling myself to task that it is not enough to have a cognitive knowing about this. You must be in relationship so that you understand beyond the book what the experience is and what the experience is about, and how you serve every day to potentially perpetuate and keep dynamics of exclusion alive and well. Folks, I believe that we can create a different world. I'm reminded of why I got into this field. And it is because it is the space that I found my voice. And I wanted to create the opportunity for so many others to do the same. Nobody else should have to deal with the exclusion and the pain that I dealt with. And so, decide what you're committed to. That might be your work right now, might be about issues of immigration. Your work right now might be about issues and experiences and understanding about ability. Your work right now, and what we're being charged to do in this association, is to consider the intersections, but also specifically the dynamics of difference that don't get voiced in the inclusion conversation. And so where do we need to keep doing, and what are you committing to do? When I left Slippery Rock State College back in I was committed to ending racism. And I was going to end racism before I left Slippery Rock. Well, so much for that. I got to Indiana University in Bloomington and discovered there was sexism. Who knew? And I was committed to ending that. And so, some 30 years later, there's something beautiful about being over 50. And what I realize is, mine may not be to fix it. But it is to leave it better than I found it. I hope you'll leave it better than you found it. Thank you.